Before these words were ever spoken aloud, they were etched into worlds long buried by time. As you listen, leave a mark of your own. Write in the comments which city you are listening from, and if this knowledge calls to you, subscribe so these chronicles may continue. Now let us open the first and most dangerous page. TORIL was not born in peace. It did not awaken beneath a benevolent sky or rise from a gentle act of creation. Its first moments were shaped by violence so immense that even the gods would later struggle to name it without reverence or restraint. When the Dawn War still echoed across the multiverse, existence itself remained unstable, raw, unfinished, and dangerous. Worlds did not yet exist as destinations. They were outcomes. In that age, gods and primordials were not abstract forces or distant principles. They were powers of will and presence, vast beyond mortal comprehension, clashing not over belief, but over reality itself. The primordials embodied elemental chaos, fire without purpose, stone without patience, oceans without memory. They did not seek to rule worlds. They were worlds in motion. The gods, by contrast, had begun to envision something different, a shaped cosmos, ordered enough to sustain continuity, meaning, and eventually life. TORIL emerged at the intersection of those opposing desires. It was not the first world conceived during the Dawn War, but it became one of the most contested. Canon sources describe TORIL as forming from coalescing matter, stabilized only after repeated divine intervention. Each act of shaping was met with resistance, as primordials tore at the forming sphere, reshaping continents through rage rather than design. Mountains were driven upward not by slow tectonic patience, but by blows delivered from entities whose footsteps fractured reality. Seas were gouged into the surface when imprisoned primordials thrashed beneath the crust, their movements carving basins that would later fill with water. Nothing about TORIL's early form was accidental. Every scar had an author. The gods responded not with unity, but with necessity. Alliances formed quickly and fractured just as fast. Deities whose portfolios would later appear harmonious, life, knowledge, order, fought alongside gods of destruction and fury because survival demanded it. In this period, the gods were not distant patrons. They were combatants, present and vulnerable, discovering through conflict that even divine power had limits. It was here that a crucial realization took shape. TORIL could not survive unlimited divine presence. Unchecked godly power threatened to tear the forming world apart as surely as primordial chaos. Each miracle destabilized something else. Each victory carried consequence. The very act of creation risked annihilation. This realization did not come through debate or prophecy. It came through failure, through regions of TORIL collapsing into elemental wastelands where no future life could endure. This is where Io's influence becomes undeniable. Though the Overgod did not participate in the Dawn War as a warrior, canon is clear that Io observed its consequences closely. The instability of TORIL demonstrated a cosmic imbalance that could not be corrected by power alone. Boundaries were required. Limits had to be imposed not on primordials alone, but on the gods themselves. Without them, TORIL would remain a battlefield rather than a world. The first constraints placed upon divine action did not weaken the gods. They refined them. Divine influence became more deliberate, more focused. Instead of reshaping entire regions through raw force, gods began imprinting aspects of themselves into the world, law into structure, death into cycles, magic into patterns rather than explosions. These were not symbolic gestures. They were mechanisms of survival. TORIL began to hold its shape not because the war ended, but because power was no longer free to act without cost. Yet the primordials were not erased. Many were slain, others were bound. Some were driven deep beneath TORIL's surface, imprisoned within the planet's forming layers. Their presence did not vanish, it fossilized. This is why TORIL would never be a passive world. Volcanic chains, seismic instability, and regions saturated with elemental energy are not later aberrations. They are remnants of TORIL's birth, consequences of victories that were never absolute. In these earliest stages, there were no mortals to witness the forging of the world. No histories were written, no prayers were spoken. But the conditions for mortality were being set nonetheless. The violence of TORIL's creation ensured that any life born upon it would inherit fragility. Permanence was impossible in a world born from conflict. Change would be inevitable. Death would be unavoidable. This was not cruelty. It was inheritance. By the end of this formative era, TORIL had achieved something rare among worlds touched by the Dawn War. Stability without stagnation. It could endure. It could recover. And most importantly, it could continue. The war did not end, but TORIL was no longer its casualty. It had become its consequence. The world existed now, not as a promise of peace, but as proof that even divine violence could be constrained into something lasting. When TORIL finally held together, it did so under strain rather than harmony. The world did not settle into quiet equilibrium. It endured, bearing the weight of powers that had not finished contesting its existence. Stability was achieved not because the conflict ceased, but because it was forced into new forms. The Dawn War no longer tore TORIL apart openly, yet its pressure remained embedded in every layer of the planet. The gods began to recognize a truth that canon sources repeatedly imply but rarely state outright. TORIL was no longer merely a battlefield. It had become leverage. Control of the world meant influence over the future shape of reality itself. The primordials understood this as well, and for them, TORIL represented something intolerable. A fixed form imposed upon a universe that was meant to remain fluid and unbound. This is why the struggle did not end with the first shaping of land and sea. Primordials that survived the initial stages of the Dawn War adapted their methods. No longer able to shatter TORIL outright without provoking unified divine retaliation, they turned inward, attacking from beneath rather than above. Canon describes vast elemental beings imprisoned within TORIL's depths, not as passive captives, but as restrained forces whose movements still echo through the world. These entities became the engines of instability, causing upheavals that appeared random to later mortals but were, in truth, acts of resistance frozen in time. The gods responded with fortification rather than conquest. Divine power was no longer expended solely in battle, but invested into the world's structure. Seas were bounded, skies were ordered. The underdark layers of TORIL formed not simply through geological process, but as consequences of divine containment. Certain regions were shaped deliberately to serve as barriers, absorbing the pressure of imprisoned primordials and preventing their influence from reaching the surface unchecked. This marked a profound shift in divine behavior. Creation became an act of strategy. Every mountain range, every deep ocean trench, every vast desert served multiple purposes. They were environments, yes, but also locks, seals, and buffers. The world itself became a containment system, designed to endure forces that could not be destroyed outright. TORIL was no longer just shaped by violence, it was engineered to survive it. Yet this engineering came at a cost. By binding primordials into the world, rather than removing them from existence, the gods ensured that TORIL would never be fully free of their influence. Elemental imbalance became a permanent feature of the planet. Fire, earth, air, and water were not neutral forces. They carried memory. They remembered the war. This is why elemental magic on TORIL has always been volatile, powerful, and dangerous. It draws not from abstract principles, but from wounded forces buried deep within the world's foundation. At the same time, the gods themselves were changing. The constraints imposed earlier were tightening. Io's boundaries were not static laws etched once and forgotten. They responded to divine behavior. The more the gods invested themselves into TORIL, the more they became bound to it in return. Their power flowed into the world, but it did not return unchanged. Divine essence anchored to TORIL could not be freely reclaimed without consequence. This created a quiet but critical imbalance among the gods. Those who invested heavily in shaping the world gained influence over its future, but also became more dependent on it. Others, more cautious or distant, retained greater freedom but less immediate control. This divergence would later define divine rivalries far more than ideology or alignment. Control versus independence, stewardship versus detachment. And beneath all of it, TORIL absorbed everything. The world did not choose sides. It endured gods and primordials alike, holding their remnants within its substance. Its crust bore divine scars. Its mantle housed bound titans. Its skies carried echoes of battles that no mortal would ever witness directly. By the end of this phase, TORIL was no longer an unfinished object of creation. It was a functioning world, but one under constant tension. A world built not to be peaceful, but to survive forces that refused to let it exist at all. From this moment onward, the question was no longer whether TORIL would endure. The question was, what kind of existence could arise upon a world forged to contain gods and monsters alike? With TORIL now capable of enduring, the gods turned to a task more complex than war or containment: definition. A world that merely survives is unstable by nature. It must also mean something to those who shape it. This was the era in which divine portfolios began to imprint themselves upon TORIL, not as abstract domains, but as operating principles woven directly into reality. Canon sources describe this phase as the gradual ordering of existence. Time became measurable. Seasons emerged. Cycles replaced endless reaction. These changes were not cosmetic. They represented the gods embedding predictability into a world born from chaos, ensuring that TORIL would no longer respond only to force, but to pattern. Cause would now precede effect. Consequence would follow action. This was a turning point. By defining how the world functioned, the gods limited how it could be altered. No single deity could reshape TORIL entirely without unraveling systems sustained by others. The planet became interdependent, its stability reliant on overlapping divine influences that could not be easily separated. What had begun as a battlefield became a network of restraints. Magic was central to this transformation. The weave did not yet exist in its later formalized state, but arcane power began to settle into channels rather than erupt as uncontrolled force. Mystra's predecessors, goddesses of magic whose names differ across eras, but whose function remains consistent in canon, anchored magical energy to TORIL itself. This decision ensured that magic would no longer tear the world apart when used, but it also bound magic's fate to the planet's condition. Magic became a stabilizing force and a vulnerability. If TORIL were damaged, magic would suffer. If magic were disrupted, TORIL would weaken. This mutual dependence was intentional. It prevented the reckless use of arcane power on a cosmic scale, forcing even gods to consider consequence. Power now had weight. Other divine influences followed similar paths. Life was introduced cautiously, not as an explosion of creation, but as controlled emergence. Early life on TORIL was resilient but limited, shaped to endure an environment still hostile and unpredictable. Death was not an afterthought. It was designed alongside life as a regulating mechanism. Without mortality, TORIL would collapse under uncontrolled growth, just as it would have under uncontrolled power. Even the skies were claimed. Deities associated with the heavens, storms, and travel imposed order upon the atmosphere, preventing TORIL's air from becoming another battlefield between elemental forces. Weather became cyclical rather than catastrophic by default. Storms still carried destruction, but no longer threatened to scour the world clean with every passing age. Yet this ordering was not without resistance. Bound primordials reacted to these changes as they had to earlier acts of shaping, with disruption. As the gods imposed structure, imprisoned forces strained against it, testing the limits of their confinement. Earthquakes increased, volcanic regions intensified, entire landmasses bore the marks of internal pressure fighting imposed order. These were not signs of failure, but evidence that TORIL was actively holding itself together. A living system under stress. It is here that TORIL ceased to be merely a location and became an entity in its own right. Not sentient in the mortal sense, but responsive. The world absorbed divine law and primordial fury alike, transforming both into geography, climate, and latent power. From this point forward, no god could act upon TORIL without altering it permanently, and without being altered in return. The gods had succeeded in making a world that could last, but they had also created a world that would remember everything done to it. Once TORIL could endure structure, the gods confronted a question they had postponed since the Dawn War's first blows. Ownership. Not in the crude sense of possession, but in responsibility. A world bound by divine law could not exist without divine oversight. Yet no single god could claim dominion without violating the balance Ao had imposed. What followed was not a treaty, but an uneasy distribution of influence. The gods divided TORIL by function rather than territory. Land was shaped under the guidance of deities tied to endurance, stone, growth, and decay. Seas fell under powers of depth, change, and hidden motion. The skies reflected gods of travel, fate, storms, and distance. These were not borders mortals would later draw on maps. They were layers of authority, overlapping and interdependent. A mountain was never only stone. It was also time, weather, life, and death acting in concert. This division reduced open conflict, but it did not end rivalry. Each divine imprint altered TORIL in subtle ways. Regions influenced by gods of order became predictable, stable, and resistant to change. Areas shaped by more chaotic or destructive deities remained volatile, rich in raw energy but prone to upheaval. These differences were not cosmetic. They determined where civilizations could later thrive and where survival would always come at a cost. One consequence became apparent quickly. The more deeply a god invested power into TORIL, the less free that god became. Divine essence anchored to the world could not be withdrawn without destabilizing what had been built. This tethering was not enforced by punishment, but by consequence. Gods who poured themselves into creation gained influence, worship potential, and legacy, but sacrificed mobility and autonomy. Others chose restraint. Some gods limited their involvement, shaping only narrow aspects of TORIL or withdrawing after initial stabilization. They remained powerful, but distant. This divergence created a lasting divide among the pantheon. Gods of presence versus gods of principle. The former shaped the world directly. The latter shaped it indirectly, through law, fate, or distant pressure. TORIL reflected this divide. Areas touched heavily by divine presence became saturated with power. Later ages would identify these regions as magically potent, spiritually significant, or dangerously unstable. Conversely, regions less shaped by gods developed more slowly, but with greater adaptability. This uneven distribution of divine influence ensured that TORIL would never be uniform and never fully controlled. Beneath the surface, the primordials remained. Their confinement had not weakened them as much as it had transformed them. Bound into TORIL's structure, their power diffused into the world itself. Elemental energy seeped upward through fault lines, ley intersections, and deep caverns. This created zones where the world behaved unpredictably, where fire burned too hot, stone moved when it should not, and water carried unnatural force. The gods recognized the danger, but also the opportunity. Rather than attempting further purges, they reinforced containment. Deep layers of TORIL were shaped specifically to absorb and redirect primordial pressure. What mortals would later call the Underdark was not a single act of creation, but the cumulative result of centuries of divine adjustment. Spaces formed to hold what could not be destroyed. This decision carried long-term consequences. By choosing containment over eradication, the gods accepted that TORIL would always carry the risk of resurgence. But they also ensured that primordial power could be accessed, intentionally or otherwise. Elemental magic, planar thinning, and catastrophic upheaval would all trace their origins back to this choice. Power buried is still power. At this stage, TORIL crossed a threshold. It was no longer a project in progress. It was a system, complex, self-reinforcing, and dangerous. Divine actions now echoed across the entire structure. A change in one aspect produced consequences elsewhere. Balance became less about peace and more about maintenance. The gods had succeeded in dividing responsibility. They had not succeeded in eliminating consequence. From this moment forward, TORIL's future would be shaped not by creation alone, but by restraint. By what the gods chose not to do, as much as by what they did. With TORIL stabilized and divided among divine influences, the focus shifted from shaping the world to testing it. The gods did not immediately create complex life. Canon makes clear that early attempts were cautious, limited, and often withdrawn. A world forged by violence could not sustain fragile creations without proving it could regulate itself. This was an age of observation. The gods watched how TORIL responded to pressure without direct intervention. Elemental forces clashed along fault lines. Climate systems adjusted to uneven divine influence. Regions collapsed, reformed, and settled again. What endured was not what was strongest, but what adapted. This lesson would later define the nature of mortal life on TORIL. During this period, divine restraint became as important as divine power. Ao's imposed boundaries were no longer theoretical. Gods who attempted to reshape TORIL too aggressively found their influence diminished or redirected. Not as punishment, but as correction. The world resisted excess. Divine will, when applied without balance, produced instability that weakened its own effectiveness. TORIL had become a regulating force. This realization altered divine strategy permanently. Instead of imposing perfection, the gods allowed imperfection to persist. Flaws in the world were no longer viewed as failures, but as pressure valves, ways for TORIL to release tension without catastrophic collapse. Deserts formed where life struggled. Storm-racked seas remained dangerous. Volcanic regions continued to erupt. These were not oversights, they were allowances. At the same time, the influence of bound primordials began to diffuse more evenly. Their power, once concentrated and destructive, spread through TORIL's elemental systems. Fire, earth, air, and water became less volatile on the surface, though never harmless. This diffusion did not weaken the primordials themselves, but it diluted their capacity to act with intent. Rage became weather. Resistance became geology. This transformation had an unintended consequence. Elemental power became accessible, not to gods alone, but potentially to lesser beings that might one day arise. By embedding primordial force into TORIL's systems, rather than isolating it completely, the gods created pathways, sources of power that could be tapped, studied, or abused. This laid the foundation for elemental magic long before mortals existed to wield it. It was during this era that TORIL's identity solidified, not as a paradise nor as a prison, but as a contested equilibrium. The world balanced divine order against primordial memory, stability against volatility. Nothing was absolute. Nothing was permanent. Change was not an anomaly. It was the core function. The gods came to understand that TORIL did not require constant correction. It required limits. By stepping back, by allowing cycles to form and consequences to unfold, they ensured the world could persist beyond their immediate presence. TORIL no longer needed to be held together by divine hands. It held itself together through systems born of conflict and restraint. This was the final test before creation could proceed. A world that survives only under supervision is not a world. It is an artifact. TORIL had proven it could endure neglect, imbalance, and internal tension without collapsing. That endurance would soon invite its most dangerous development yet. Not more power, but life. Life did not arrive on TORIL as a gift. It emerged as a calculated risk. When the gods finally turned from observation to intervention, they did so with restraint shaped by everything TORIL had already endured. Canon sources emphasize that early life on TORIL was not delicate or idealized. It was designed to persist in a world still carrying elemental instability, divine residue, and buried primordial force. The first living forms were resilient by necessity, shaped to survive fluctuation rather than comfort. This choice defined mortality from the beginning. Life on TORIL was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to continue. Death was not a flaw introduced later. It was embedded into the system as a regulator, a means of preventing stagnation and collapse. In a world where power could accumulate catastrophically, impermanence was safety. The gods did not agree on how life should take shape. Some favored adaptability, others structure. Some valued endurance, others growth. These differences did not erupt into war, but they did manifest in diversity. Early mortal races reflected competing divine philosophies, each carrying strengths and limitations derived from the gods who shaped them. No race was complete. No design was final. This was intentional. A single perfected creation would have been brittle. Diversity ensured survival through variation. When one form failed, another endured. When environments shifted, some adapted. TORIL's violent origin demanded this redundancy. Life had to mirror the world that hosted it. Magic played a decisive role. As the weave continued to settle into stable patterns, it became accessible to living beings, not as an inheritance, but as a consequence of proximity. Magic permeated TORIL's structure so thoroughly that life could not avoid interacting with it. Even those without awareness were shaped by its presence. Longer lifespans here, heightened resilience there, strange mutations elsewhere. This created a quiet imbalance. Life on TORIL was not neutral. It was touched. Mortals would never exist independently of the forces that shaped the world beneath them. Their triumphs and failures would always echo divine and primordial influence, whether they understood it or not. Free will existed, but never in isolation. The gods observed closely. They did not yet demand worship. Faith was not required for divine survival in this era. Instead, the gods watched how life interacted with the systems they had created. Could mortals endure magic without destabilizing it? Could societies form without provoking catastrophic imbalance? Could intelligence exist in a world where power was so close to the surface? The answers were mixed. Some early civilizations failed quickly, erased by environmental pressure or internal collapse. Others endured, adapting to the rhythms of TORIL rather than resisting them. These outcomes taught the gods another difficult lesson. Intervention often caused more harm than absence. Mortals who were protected too heavily grew dependent. Those forced to adapt grew resilient. This realization marked a turning point. The gods began to withdraw, not fully, but deliberately. Influence replaced control. Guidance replaced command. TORIL was no longer merely a world that could survive divine violence. It had become a world capable of producing beings who could survive divine absence. That, more than anything, confirmed the success of its creation. TORIL had not been forged to host gods. It had been forged to endure after them. As mortal life spread across TORIL, divine presence shifted from creation to influence. The gods did not vanish, but they altered how they acted upon the world. Direct shaping gave way to symbols, dreams, omens, and subtle pressure. This was not retreat born of weakness. It was adaptation to a world that no longer tolerated constant divine intrusion. Faith emerged organically. Canon makes clear that worship was not initially demanded. It was discovered. Mortals, confronted with a world that rewarded balance and punished excess, began seeking meaning behind forces they could not fully comprehend. Storms, seasons, fertility, death, and magic all bore traces of divine origin. Recognition followed experience, not decree. This changed everything. Once belief entered the system, TORIL became more than a physical world. It became a spiritual ecosystem. Divine power, once drawn directly from cosmic authority, now flowed increasingly through mortal perception and reverence. The gods did not lose power, but its source diversified. Influence over TORIL became inseparable from influence over those who lived upon it. This development carried a hidden risk. Divine identity began to crystallize around mortal expectation. Gods associated with rigid concepts grew more constrained by them. Those tied to broader forces retained flexibility but risked dilution. The pantheon began to evolve, not in essence but in expression, shaped partially by the beliefs of those who named them. Io's boundaries tightened further. The rise of faith introduced new instability. Belief amplified power, but also intensified rivalry. Ao's role as overseer became more pronounced, ensuring that divine conflict did not once again spill unchecked into TORIL's structure. Gods could influence mortals. They could not reshape the world freely in response to devotion alone. This enforced separation preserved TORIL, but deepened divine competition. Instead of battling each other directly, gods vied for relevance, interpretation, and alignment with mortal values. Influence replaced domination. This shift reduced cosmic destruction, but it did not reduce consequence. Wars of belief would later scar TORIL as deeply as any primordial upheaval. Beneath the surface, ancient tensions persisted. Bound primordials remained silent but active, their presence felt through elemental disturbances that mortals would later mythologize as curses or divine wrath. These events were not punishments, they were echoes. The world was still settling, still balancing forces older than faith itself. TORIL absorbed this new complexity without breaking. It had become layered, physical, magical, and spiritual, all interacting simultaneously. No single force governed it entirely. Not gods, not mortals, not the imprisoned remnants beneath its crust. Power circulated rather than concentrated, reducing the risk of total collapse. This was the unintended triumph of TORIL's violent birth. A world forged through conflict had learned how to distribute it. From this point forward, TORIL's fate would no longer be defined solely by gods or primordials, but by how all forces, divine, mortal, and elemental, interacted within limits that none could fully escape. With faith now woven into TORIL's structure, divine conflict transformed again, not into silence, but into permanence. The gods were no longer shaping a world in formation. They were maintaining a world in motion. Every intervention carried risk, not only to mortals, but to the balance Ao had enforced since TORIL's earliest stabilization. This era revealed a sobering truth. Creation had not ended the Dawn War. It had contained it. The struggle between divine order and primordial chaos persisted, no longer as open battle, but as pressure within systems that could not be allowed to fail. The gods understood that TORIL's survival depended on continuity. Large-scale destruction was now unacceptable, not because it was impossible, but because it would unravel everything that followed creation: faith, magic, life, and consequence. As a result, divine power became conditional. Gods could act, but only through channels TORIL could withstand. Avatars, chosen servants, sacred sites, and indirect miracles replaced raw manifestation. This was not merely a limitation imposed from above. It was a practical necessity. TORIL could endure influence. It could not endure presence. This limitation reshaped divine ambition. Instead of conquering the world, gods sought to define it. Law, chaos, death, knowledge, destruction, and renewal competed not through force, but through persistence. The question was no longer who could dominate TORIL, but whose influence would last the longest without destabilizing it. Meanwhile, the primordials remained trapped within the world they had helped shape. Canon consistently depicts their imprisonment as incomplete victory. Their power was neither extinguished nor inert. It diffused, shaping regions where TORIL resisted uniformity, places where reality thinned, where elemental planes pressed close, where the world behaved as though the Dawn War had never fully ended. These regions were not failures. They were compromises. TORIL required outlets for pressure it could not eliminate. By allowing certain areas to remain unstable, the world avoided global collapse. Cataclysm was localized. Destruction was limited. The scars of creation became safeguards rather than weaknesses. Mortals, unaware of these origins, would later fear such places. But fear did not negate function. At the same time, the gods themselves grew increasingly dependent on TORIL's continuation. Faith bound them to the world's survival. The weave bound their power to its stability. Ao's oversight ensured that no god could escape consequence by abandoning the system they now relied upon. This reversed the relationship between creator and creation. TORIL no longer needed the gods to exist. The gods needed TORIL to remain. This dependency introduced restraint more effective than any imposed law. Divine destruction now threatened divine extinction, not immediately, but inevitably. A world stripped of life, faith, and balance would no longer sustain the structures that empowered the pantheon. Thus, TORIL entered a state of guarded equilibrium, not peace, not stagnation, but controlled tension, maintained through limits learned the hard way. The violence that forged the world had not been erased. It had been transformed into memory, structure, and warning. TORIL endured because it remembered what unchecked power had nearly destroyed, and because, at last, even gods had learned to fear the consequences of breaking it. By the time TORIL reached true continuity, its defining trait was no longer creation, conflict, or even faith. It was memory. The world carried the accumulated weight of every force that had shaped it, and those forces now operated within constraints they could neither ignore nor escape. This memory expressed itself through pattern. Cycles governed existence on TORIL: rise and decline, growth and decay, stability and upheaval. These were not philosophical concepts imposed later by scholars. They were structural features embedded during the world's forging. Civilizations would rise where balance held, and collapse where power accumulated too quickly. Magic would flourish where restraint guided it, and devastate where it did not. Nothing was exempt. Even the gods were subject to these rhythms. Divine influence waxed and waned not solely through will, but through alignment with TORIL's enduring systems. Gods who adapted to the world's limits endured. Those who resisted them diminished, fractured, or were forced into narrower expressions of their portfolios. Survival now favored compatibility over dominance. This was the final transformation of divine authority. Power no longer meant the ability to reshape TORIL at will. It meant the ability to persist without destabilizing it. The most enduring gods were not those who acted most dramatically, but those whose influence integrated seamlessly into the world's ongoing function. Law that regulated, death that cycled, magic that flowed without rupture. The primordials, by contrast, became increasingly distant. Their presence remained undeniable, but their agency eroded over time. Bound, diffused, and constrained by TORIL's stabilizing systems, they lost the capacity for coordinated resistance. Their legacy endured not as intent, but as environment. Fire still raged, stone still shifted, seas still consumed. But these acts no longer carried purpose. They were echoes, not commands. Mortals inherited this world without knowing its cost. To them, mountains were simply mountains. Storms were weather. Magic was a tool. Few understood that these features were the fossilized remains of divine decisions and primordial defiance. Even fewer grasped that TORIL's apparent normalcy was the product of constant, invisible balance. Yet this ignorance was necessary. A world that constantly remembered its own fragility would never progress. Mortals needed the illusion of permanence in order to build, explore, and risk everything. TORIL provided that illusion, not by being safe, but by being stable enough. That stability was hard-won. It rested on laws enforced by Io, systems maintained by the gods, pressures absorbed by the world itself, and limits accepted, often unwillingly, by every power involved. No single force controlled TORIL. That, more than any miracle, ensured its survival. By this stage, TORIL was complete, not finished, never finished, but whole, a world capable of enduring history rather than being erased by it. The birth of TORIL cannot be measured by the moment its lands solidified or its skies cleared. It is measured by what followed and what did not. A world forged by divine violence should, by every precedent of the Dawn War, have torn itself apart. That TORIL endured is not evidence of harmony, but of restraint learned through near failure. TORIL survived because power was broken into limits. Gods learned that unchecked creation was indistinguishable from destruction. Primordials learned that raw force could be buried, diluted, and rendered into structure. Ao ensured that neither lesson could ever be forgotten, embedding consequence into the fabric of existence itself. From that point forward, no act of power could occur without echo. This made TORIL unique among worlds touched by the Dawn War. It was not cleansed of its origins. It was shaped by them. The scars of divine conflict became mountains. The prisons of defeated primordials became continents. The compromises of gods became systems, magic, death, faith, and time, each carrying traces of the violence that gave them form. Creation did not erase the war. It fossilized it. This is why TORIL has never been a quiet world. Cataclysms recur. Empires fall. Magic surges and collapses. Faith reshapes gods as often as gods reshape faith. These are not signs of instability. They are symptoms of a world designed to release pressure rather than accumulate it to breaking point. TORIL was never meant to be perfect. Perfection would have been fragile. Instead, it was built to absorb contradiction, to allow order and chaos, faith and doubt, life and death to coexist without annihilating one another. Every system on TORIL exists because something else was restrained. Every stability is paid for with limitation. Even the gods live within this truth. They are no longer architects standing above creation. They are participants bound to its continuation. Their power flows through TORIL, but it does not escape it. To destroy the world would be to erase the foundation of their own existence. This dependency is the final consequence of the violence that forged TORIL. The creators became accountable to the creation, and mortals inherited the result. A world ancient beyond memory, dangerous without malice, and stable without kindness. A world where survival is possible precisely because nothing is absolute. Where history can unfold because no force is allowed to end it outright. TORIL endures not because it was born gently, but because it was born contested. Its mountains remember blows from gods. Its depths remember imprisoned titans. Its magic remembers restraint. And its continued existence stands as a quiet, enduring truth of the forgotten realms. Creation did not triumph over violence. It learned to live with it, and that made the world last.